Many thousands of years ago, when the sands of time stood still, and before the existence of any man or beast, before these things were so, over the Sahara Desert, storms of incredible proportions and of terrifying size whirled and twirled for centuries. And as far as the eye could see across these oceans of sand, a small sparkle appeared in the distance. And as the winds blew, and as the sands shifted, and as the years passed, the McLaren was born. One of the reasons why the McLaren is so fast is its traction control system. It's a system that really performs in the rain. But such a system is not needed here, for in this desolate wasteland there is no rain. In fact, not much is needed here, except an open road and a lot of gas. Luckily, thanks to abiogenesis and evolution, the McLaren comes equipped with both. Not only did this McLaren magically appear, but it appeared magically without ingenuity and for no reason or purpose whatsoever on this black pavement we call a road.
To handle production.
Recently, Thunderfoot, the maniacal atheist YouTuber, projected his own hateful thoughts and opinions onto the God of the Bible by saying that God had great pleasure out of destroying the entire human race by Noah's flood in his most recent video, Why Do People Laugh at Creationists?
Actually, Kent, no. It's exactly like lily pads floating around in a pond. Exactly. And for the exact same reason. And no, the continents defined by the continental crust are no more touching than these lilies are touching. Look, you lifted this figure out of a book for teenagers and put it up whilst you were saying that the continents don't float around like lilies in a bathtub. Let's do something crazy. Let's read the caption to that figure, shall we? Continental crust is much lighter in weight, by which they actually mean it's less dense and thicker than oceanic crust.
The Bible says in Genesis 6, God saw the wickedness of man, and his imaginations of his heart was evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he made man, and grieved him at his heart. And God said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth. It repented me that I have made them.
And what better way of doing that than building in this natural disaster that would kill all of these people into his design?
Now, despite the fact that the Bible tells us why God destroyed the world, and despite the fact that the Bible is full of examples of God's love and mercy, Thunderfoot overlooks the righteous judgment of God along with his loving kindnesses and focuses only on the catastrophe that occurred centuries ago and twisted the story to make it seem as though God murdered millions of innocent people as opposed to righteously judging millions of guilty sinners. That's like blaming the coach for not putting you in the game. If you're horrible at a sport, you can't blame the coach who wants to win for not putting you, your lousy self, in the game. It's you who needs to put yourself in the game by training harder and getting better at your sport. Or it's like blaming the government for putting murderers on death row. The government didn't put those murderers on death row. These murderers put themselves there. In addition to his ramblings against the very God who gave his son for Thunderfoot, he goes on to argue that Pangea is a legitimate scientific theory. Now, if you don't know what Pangea is, let me briefly explain what it is. Basically, Pangea is the idea that all of the 7 continents on Earth were connected at one point millions of years ago to form a supercontinent, and over the course of time, these continents drifted apart.
As for your claim that this oceanic spreading that we can observe is not evidence for plate tectonics, that's some pretty hardcore denial there. That's the sort of denial that would claim that Africa and South America don't actually fit. It all lies in the textbooks.
Now let's suppose that Thunderfoot is right and that the continents do move and that they have been moving for the past 180 million years. As far as what we are told about the rate of the speed at which the continents are drifting, it ranges from about 1 centimeter per year to about 10 centimeters per year. Some sources say that the Mid-Atlantic Ridge has a spread rate of about 2.5 centimeters per year. And since the Pangea theory states that all the continents were at one point connected, you can see that part of North America was connected to Africa. And since we can calculate the distance between America and Africa, we know that they are approximately 8,100 miles apart. And if you were to do the math, you would find out that if North America was in fact spreading away from Africa at a rate of about 2.5 centimeters per year, over the course of 180 million years, it would have only moved about 2,796 miles. That's not even half the distance that the continents are at now. Not only does the math not fit the theory, but wouldn't the continents look completely different if they drifted that far apart, especially when you factor in things like erosion on the coasts? And how one could even measure the rate of speed that the continents are drifting apart is a mystery itself. How do they accurately calculate the speed rate? The fact is, the coastlines of the continents only appear to fit each other to form a supercontinent. Jesus said, "Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment." That's in John chapter 7. If you are only making assumptions based upon the appearance of things, then perhaps your deductive reasoning is off. And that is one major mistake that proponents of evolution make. They base the majority of their so-called evidence of evolution on the appearance of animals sharing similar features like bone structures. They conclude similarities are proof of a common ancestor, when in fact it could be argued that it's only proof of a common creator. But if the continents truly have been drifting for millions of years, the amount of erosion that the coastlines would have experienced would have made the continents to appear completely different than they do now. Yet somehow when you look at Pangea and the movement of the continents, they appear absolutely no different at their separate form than when they started out as a supercontinent.
On a bigger scale, the gradual shifting of the Earth's crust is slowly moving even bigger things, like the oceans and the continents. So one day, our planet will look different, maybe a lot different from how it looks now. This is a picture taken from space of the coastline of Massachusetts in the northeastern United States. It's part of a landform called Cape Cod, and the picture shows what the beaches and islands around it looked like in 1984. Now look at this photo from 2014. What's different? There are actually more islands in 2014 than there were before. Back in 1984, that long strip of land was North Beach. Now, that strip of land has been chopped up into separate islands.
The fact is, Pangea has never been proven to be true. The idea of Pangea was first postulated in 1912 by Alfred Wegener. Yet according to history, the only reason why he even came up with the theory was because he looked at the continents and thought that they fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. So even back then, people were making the mistake of judging by appearance. They were judging by what they saw. Well, with that kind of conclusive logic, you can say that anybody could look at a map of the United States and see that Iowa, Missouri, and Arkansas forms what looks like a person. But that doesn't mean that at one point they were perfectly arranged with California to form the face of Bozo the Clown. You could also look at the state of Montana and see that the west part of it looks like a face. But that doesn't mean that it used to border the state of Florida to form what looks like Abraham Lincoln. Because you see, the difference between the states drifting apart versus the continents is that there is no difference. Just like the states are connected to each other to where they are not going to drift apart unless by some catastrophic event, the continents also are connected, albeit the part where they are connected are simply covered underneath the oceans. And what's funny is that the picture that Thunderfoot uses for his illustration even admits that the continental crust is joined to the oceanic crust, which means they are connected.
So yes, the continents may be moving some, but that doesn't mean they were, Africa and South America fit. So what? My house and the neighbor's house would fit too if you took the street out of the way. So it doesn't prove they used to be connected. It's just that the shape is pure coincidence.
Yeah, there's just one problem with that. There isn't a mid-Atlantic ridge between you and your neighbor's house where you can actually measure the rate of the spreading. That is, you can see the mechanism which causes the spreading of the continents. As for you and your neighbor's house being on opposite sides of the street, well, we know the mechanism that causes that too. People tend to build their houses on roads for access. We know the mechanisms that create these patterns. We can watch people building houses on opposite sides of the street, and we can measure the rate of spreading. We know the mechanism which causes it. I don't have to watch all the houses being built for the last 1,000 years to know that people building houses on roads for access is the mechanism which forms this pattern.
Thunderfoot goes on to mock Dr. Hovind by saying that there is not a mid-Atlantic ridge between him and his neighbor's house where you can measure the rate of the spreading. And to that I would have to say that if there was a crack in the middle of the street, then technically there would be a scalable mid-Atlantic ridge that separates Dr. Hovind's house from his neighbor's house. And we could essentially measure the rate of the spread of the crack of the road to determine if at one point the houses were indeed joined together millions of years ago, supposing that maybe it is possible that the houses were slowly spreading apart. And even at that point, you could see that their houses are in no way comparable to lily pads floating in a pond. But because we all know that a crack in the road does not necessarily mean proof of a superhouse made up of 7 separate houses, it's even more difficult to make the assumption that Pangea actually existed based upon only the existence of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, or any ridge for that matter. And even if the continents do drift, this does not prove that the Earth is millions of years old, nor does it disprove the existence of God, or that God is malevolent. And lastly, it does not prove the theory of Pangea. But this is how silly the theory of Pangea really is. If the continents are indeed drifting, the rate of the drift is so small that it would literally take millions of years to even notice the difference. And by then, the sun would have burned to such a small size that the Earth would have frozen over because of the lack of the sun's heat. By the way, speaking of houses, it makes perfect sense to make the conclusion that these houses were in fact built by somebody. But with your atheist logic, you, Thunderfoot, assume that they arose on their own over millions of years by random chance. And that's like saying that 1,000 sandstorms in the Sahara Desert can somehow cause a McLaren to magically appear on a perfectly paved road. Hebrews chapter 3 says, "For every house is builded by some man, but he that built all things is God." We Christians are trying to say that houses can only be built by intelligence, whereas people like Thunderfoot are trying to say that the houses got there by explosions, mutations, and survival of the fittest. If anything, the historical geography of the earth proves the magnificence of God, not the maliciousness of God. And anyone who can read the Bible for themselves can clearly see that God's ultimate desire for mankind has always been their salvation, not their destruction. So if mankind has ever perished by means of a flood, which it did, it is because of their own wrongdoings and violence, not because of God's cruelty. If mankind ever suffers a similar fate in the future, and it will, it's because of the same foolish choices and decisions that they make against themselves, and not because God wishes to commit mass genocide. Indeed, I think John 3:16 makes it clear that God's desire is to save the world, not destroy it. It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved."